A police officer's bias drives him to abuse his authority, stopping a black man solely based on appearances. Little does he know, the man he is trying to belittle is none other than the internal affairs chief, someone who holds the power to shape his career's future. A seemingly minor encounter unravels shocking truths, shaking a system riddled with injustice. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to hit subscribe to help us spread impactful, emotional stories like this one. The vibrant hues of a Sacramento sunset bathed the bustling streets in golden light. Marcus Evans, a polished and accomplished black man, drove his sleek sedan with calm precision. The soft strains of jazz flowed from his car's radio, blending with the gentle hum of the engine, easing away the fatigue of a long workday. Adjusting the air conditioning, Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts wandering to the dinner awaiting him at home with his family. Elsewhere in the city, Nathan Blake, a middle-aged police officer, sat behind the wheel of his patrol car. His face bore the marks of a long day filled with minor, yet relentlessly stressful incidents. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his gaze distant as cars passed by. For Nathan, the end of his shift seemed within reach, yet the simmering tension inside him refused to fade. Suddenly, a light gray sedan caught Nathan's attention as it sped through an intersection just as the traffic light turned yellow, quickly transitioning to red. Nathan's instincts kicked in. He activated his sirens and flashing lights, signaling the car to pull over. The sedan slowed and came to a stop by the curb, red and blue lights flickering against its windows. Marcus exhaled deeply, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Glancing into his rearview mirror, he spotted the police cruiser parked behind him. In the quiet of that moment, a familiar unease began to rise, a ripple of emotions he knew all too well from similar situations in the past. Back in the patrol car, Nathan adjusted his belt and double-checked his badge before stepping out. An inexplicable discomfort churned within him, not necessarily about the traffic violation, but something he couldn't quite put into words. The weariness clouding Nathan's mind morphed into a rigid demeanor, as though he had found a focus for his frustrations. Nathan emerged from his car just as the sunset hues began to fade. Yet, in this fateful encounter, the true colors of power and prejudice were about to be revealed. Nathan walked slowly toward Marcus's sedan, his sharp gaze sweeping over the car's window. In that fleeting moment, he didn't just see a driver, but seemed to perceive a representation of deeply rooted prejudices. Nathan adjusted his belt slightly, his hand brushing against the holstered gun at his hip, a nearly unconscious but clearly demonstrative gesture of authority. "License and registration," Nathan demanded, his voice cold but clear. Marcus, seated firmly in the driver's seat, looked up at Nathan with a calm expression. Without a word of complaint, he opened the glove compartment, retrieved the required documents, and handed them through the window. Marcus's hand moved deliberately, every motion careful, as though to avoid any potential misunderstanding. Nathan took the documents, but instead of examining them immediately, his gaze shifted back to Marcus, scrutinizing him intently, as if searching for something amiss. "Where do you live?" Nathan asked, his tone no longer entirely neutral. "My address is clearly stated on my license," Marcus replied, his voice polite but unwavering. "Then what are you doing in this area?" Nathan continued, narrowing his eyes. Marcus paused briefly, his gaze steady, carrying a subtle hint of inquiry. "I'm on my way home," he answered, his tone devoid of tension. But that simple response didn't seem to satisfy Nathan. "I don't think you're familiar with this area," he remarked, his tone laced with implication. "You're not from around here, are you?" The atmosphere in that moment grew heavy. Marcus recognized the shift. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. Nathan's attention wasn't on the license or registration, but on Marcus himself, on what Nathan thought Marcus represented. "The address on my license is accurate," Marcus reiterated, his tone still calm but carrying a faint edge that suggested he intended to end this needless conversation. Nathan smirked faintly, the brief smile anything but friendly. He didn't take his eyes off Marcus, as though the man's composure was a challenge. "Funny," Nathan said, his tone turning sarcastic. "Most people don't stay as calm as you when they're pulled over by the police." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply tilted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Nathan's without hesitation, without fear, without flinching. This demeanor unsettled Nathan more than he cared to admit. To him, Marcus didn't resemble the people he had pulled over before. There was no fear, no fumbling, no rush to explain or justify. That attitude, to Nathan, was an anomaly he couldn't ignore. The next few seconds stretched unnaturally long. Nathan finally glanced down at the license, though only briefly and with apparent disinterest. Finding nothing wrong, he folded the documents, slid them into his jacket pocket, and spoke in a tone brimming with control. "All right, step out of the car. I need to check a few more things." Marcus, still seated, raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is there a specific reason for this, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with a pointed curiosity. Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding quickly. "This is standard procedure. Cooperation will make this easier for both of us." That response, more than the words themselves, carried an underlying message. Not a request, but an unspoken command, an exertion of power. Marcus understood this. Instead of resisting, he slowly opened the car door and stepped out, his movements deliberate, as though he were the one in control of the situation. Nathan took a step back, his eyes fixed on Marcus, who, in his mind, was no longer just a traffic violator. In Nathan's perception, Marcus had become a problem to be dealt with, not through the law, but through authority. But what Nathan had yet to realize was that this authority might not belong to him in the way he thought it did. Nathan stood upright, his hands loosely resting on his belt, his eyes fixed on Marcus as if searching for some clue to latch on to. The silence between them was broken by Nathan's probing, almost taunting question. "Do people like you always drive like this?" Marcus lifted his head, meeting Nathan's gaze with sharp yet composed eyes. A brief silence lingered, as if Marcus were debating whether to respond. Finally, he chose to answer with calm, understated intent. "Is there something wrong with my car, officer?" Nathan tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk playing on his lips, not one of humor, but of subtle derision. "No, it's a bit different from the cars I usually see. This kind of car." He paused, his eyes flickering over Marcus's impeccably tailored suit. "Doesn't typically show up here at this hour." Nathan's words, though indirect, carried an unmistakable undertone. He didn't need to say it outright, because he knew Marcus would grasp the implication, that a black man like him didn't belong with the car he was driving or in the neighborhood he was passing through. Marcus's demeanor remained unchanged. He stood tall, his gaze steady on Nathan, his shoulders natural yet resolute. "I didn't think the time or the car I drive were matters of concern," Marcus replied, his tone polite but distinctly assertive. Marcus's confidence only aggravated Nathan further. Inside Nathan's mind, conflicting thoughts clashed. To him, Marcus's calmness and forthright responses didn't signify cooperation, but instead felt like veiled defiance. Long-held biases stirred within Nathan, creating an uneasy sense that he was losing control. Nathan stepped forward, closing the distance between them to assert his authority. "You seem to know how to handle yourself around cops," Nathan said, his voice turning sharper. "I'm guessing this isn't your first time in a situation like this?" Marcus gave a faint smile, one that was subtle yet brimming with confidence. "Perhaps not, but I've always made it a point to know my rights." The response was like a dagger to Nathan's pride. He didn't like being lectured, especially by someone like Marcus, a man who, in Nathan's eyes, had no right to exude such confidence and knowledge. "Don't think you're smarter than me," Nathan shot back, his voice hardening. "People like you." He stopped short, realizing he had gone too far, but the words had already left their mark. Marcus blinked, showing no trace of surprise or anger. He merely tilted his head slightly, his gaze cold and unwavering. "People like me?" Marcus echoed, his voice low but laden with the weight of a challenge. Nathan didn't reply immediately. His gaze faltered for a moment before regaining its steely edge. "What I mean is," he began, trying to adjust his tone, "you know, usually people who have nothing to hide aren't this confident." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, but it wasn't mocking. It was a knowing laugh, a recognition of the dynamic at play, one that neither startled nor deterred him. "Confidence isn't a sign of hiding something," Marcus said evenly. "Confidence comes from knowing exactly where you stand and what you're doing." Nathan felt his authority slipping away. Marcus's composure not only irritated him but made him feel as if he were the one being judged. For a fleeting moment, Nathan no longer saw Marcus as just another person. He became a symbol that Nathan felt compelled to subdue, to reclaim his sense of control. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Nathan ordered, his voice sharper now, his patience worn thin. Marcus held Nathan's gaze for another moment before complying. His movements remained steady, unhurried, devoid of any sign of panic or fear. His calm demeanor seemed to enrage Nathan even more. In that moment, Nathan's biases were no longer subtle. They erupted, overtaking his rationality. He was no longer acting out of duty but from a fragile need to assert dominance, a need so thinly veiled that he himself failed to recognize how deeply it was rooted in insecurity. Marcus stood next to his sedan, his hands resting lightly on the hood, his back straight, and his gaze fixed forward. His calm demeanor wasn't a natural reaction, it was the product of experience. He knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Behind him, Nathan deliberately stretched the silence, as if emphasizing that he was the one in control before proceeding with the inspection. The atmosphere grew tense, with the only sound being Nathan's heavy footsteps on the pavement. He moved slowly, almost intentionally prolonging Marcus's wait. When Nathan placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, the touch was anything but gentle. He began the pat-down, his rough hands sweeping over Marcus with quick but forceful movements. "Are you carrying a weapon?" Nathan asked, his voice lowering as if searching for an excuse to justify his actions. Marcus didn't turn his head. He replied in a steady but firm tone, "No, I'm not carrying any weapons." That simple answer seemed to aggravate Nathan even more. His hands moved over Marcus's jacket pockets, belt, and legs, each motion growing rougher. Even though he found nothing, Nathan continued the search, as though determined to unearth something that would validate his authority. But Marcus didn't react. He stood still, unshaken, showing no signs of anger or discomfort. His calmness only heightened Nathan's frustration. In Nathan's mind, Marcus wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of something Nathan couldn't control, a challenge to his already bruised ego. "You seem used to this," Nathan remarked, his tone laced with mockery. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. "Used to it, but not for the reasons you think." The ambiguous response only deepened Nathan's irritation. He circled Marcus, positioning himself in front of him, his eyes scanning Marcus's face for any hint of fear or unease. But Marcus remained unyielding, his gaze steady like a calm lake, with a glint of sharpness buried deep within. "You know," Nathan continued, his voice now tinged with derision, "people who have nothing to hide don't usually stay this calm. Or maybe people who know they've done nothing wrong don't let fear dictate their actions," Marcus replied, each word deliberate and weighted. Marcus's words cut through Nathan's fragile confidence like a blade. Nathan stepped closer, the gap between them now so narrow that the tension in the air became palpable. "Listen," Nathan said sharply, "you don't get to decide what I should or shouldn't do. Understand?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He slowly turned his head, meeting Nathan's gaze directly. "I'm not trying to decide anything. I just hope you're acting based on reason, not prejudice." The statement struck Nathan's pride like a blow. He inhaled deeply, attempting to mask the growing unease within him. To Nathan, this was no longer just a traffic stop. It had become a battle of dominance, and he wasn't about to let himself lose. "Fine," Nathan said through gritted teeth, stepping back slightly. "Let's see how long you can keep that attitude." With that, Nathan pulled out his notebook, as if preparing to jot something down. But the act wasn't procedural. It was a power play, a means to prolong his control and assert that he was still in charge. Marcus remained still, unmoving, though his gaze grew sharper. His calm demeanor was no longer merely defensive. It had become a silent warning that he was not easily subdued. Though he wouldn't admit it, Nathan began to sense a shift in the balance of power. Marcus wasn't someone he could easily intimidate, and in Nathan's mind, that wasn't just a personal failure. It was a direct threat to the authority he was so desperate to maintain. Nathan folded his notebook shut, his gaze locked onto Marcus. Despite finding nothing suspicious, he maintained an air of authority, as though the prolonged scrutiny might disguise his own sense of inadequacy. A tense silence hung in the air. Nathan took a deep breath, trying to reassert control in the confrontation. "What do you do for a living?" Nathan asked, his tone sharp, as if aiming to pierce through Marcus's calm exterior. Marcus met Nathan's eyes directly, unblinking. "I work in management," he replied curtly, offering no additional information, a deliberate move to maintain control of the situation. Nathan frowned, dissatisfied with the vague response. "Management of what? A store? Or are you freelancing?" he pressed, his tone laced with a touch of mockery. Marcus remained composed. "I manage people who need to be held accountable for their actions," he replied, each word measured and deliberate. The answer made Nathan pause briefly, but he quickly masked his hesitation with a derisive smirk. "Sounds important," he said with a sneer. Leaning in closer, his eyes narrowed. "But that doesn't mean you have the right to run a yellow light." People like you always think they can bend the rules and get away with it." For the first time during their exchange, Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly. Tilting his head, he stared directly at Nathan. "People like me?" he asked, his voice low and steady, each word cutting like an invisible blade. The question wasn't just a response. It was a direct challenge, forcing Nathan to confront his own words. The sharpness in Marcus's gaze unsettled Nathan, and the discomfort was evident in his expression. Nathan took half a step back, as if realizing he had crossed a fragile line. "What I mean is," he began, but his sentence trailed off. For a moment, he couldn't find the words to finish. Marcus didn't let the moment slip. "What do you mean, officer?" he continued, his tone calm yet weighted. "Are you implying something specific about me? Or is this just another way to assert your authority?" Nathan felt a surge of anger rise within him, not just at Marcus's words, but at the growing sense that he was losing control of the situation. "I'm just doing my job," Nathan said, trying to regain his cold demeanor. "And what is your job?" Marcus asked, his voice never rising but each word as sharp as a knife. "To ensure everyone's safety? Or to assert your superiority by throwing around insults and intimidation?" Nathan felt every word hit like a blow to his pride. He clenched his fists, his gaze turning more aggressive. "You have no right to question me," Nathan snapped, his tone hardening. "No, I'm not questioning," Marcus replied, his eyes now cold as steel. "I'm simply trying to understand why a police officer feels the need to treat me this way. Is there something I've done wrong, or do you just see me as someone unworthy of respect?" Though Marcus spoke calmly, his words struck deep, exposing Nathan in a way that made him feel raw and vulnerable. An invisible pressure weighed down on Nathan, a shift in the balance of power he had always believed was his to command. Nathan stepped back, not to relax, but to reassess. He looked at Marcus as though contemplating his next move. Yet, deep down, Nathan knew that no matter how hard he tried, he could not shatter the composure of the man standing before him. And that realization frightened him more than anything else. Nathan, though standing face to face with Marcus, felt as if he were being forced to retreat step by step in this confrontation. He clenched his fists, his eyes flickering with a mix of confusion and anger. Marcus's composure not only rattled Nathan, but also forced him to confront an uncomfortable question. Who was truly in control here? "You think you can keep talking to me like that without consequences?" Nathan growled, attempting to regain his footing. "I'll ask you one more time. Who are you really? Who do you think you are? Some kind of big shot?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He exhaled softly, his eyes reflecting not fear or unease, but a tinge of disappointment. "I think it's time you learned who I am," Marcus said, his voice low, but each word hit the air with a weight that Nathan couldn't ignore. Nathan squinted, a forced, mocking grin spreading across his lips. "Oh, really? So who are you? A lawyer? A politician? Or maybe—" Marcus didn't let him finish. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his movements deliberate, ensuring Nathan wouldn't misunderstand. "I'm going to show you something," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of warning. "No need to get jumpy." Nathan's eyes followed the motion cautiously, his right hand instinctively inching closer to the gun at his hip. But when Marcus pulled out a brown leather wallet, Nathan realized his fears were unfounded. Marcus opened the wallet, revealing a gleaming silver badge that caught the street light and reflected it sharply. "Marcus Evans," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "Chief of Internal Affairs for the city of Sacramento." The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Nathan stared at the badge, his eyes widening for a moment before he managed to regain control of his expression. A surge of confusion, fear, and helplessness hit him, rendering him momentarily speechless, as if every ounce of power he thought he held had been drained. "You're kidding," Nathan muttered, trying to mask his shock. "You're saying you're... what, exactly?" "Chief of Internal Affairs," Marcus repeated, his gaze unwavering. "My job is to oversee and ensure that police officers in this city adhere to the highest standards of ethics and accountability." Nathan instinctively stepped back half a step, as if physically pushed by the weight of those words. The badge before him wasn't just a symbol. It was a statement that the man he had just tried to intimidate not only held authority, but wielded more power within the system than he did. "There must be some kind of mistake here," Nathan stammered, his voice unsteady but still attempting to sound firm. "If you're really who you say you are, then why are you out here driving like any ordinary person?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint glimmer of irony flickering in his eyes. "I didn't realize driving home after a day's work was supposed to be a privilege. Did you, officer?" he replied, his tone light yet brimming with quiet dominance. Nathan felt cornered, not by Marcus's words but by his own actions leading up to this moment. The questioning, the scrutiny, the prejudice, it all seemed indefensible in the face of the title and position of the man he had tried to belittle. "Look," Nathan began, his voice trembling slightly, "if you really are the Chief of Internal Affairs, then I'm sure we can resolve this more calmly." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were just inches apart. His eyes, sharp and unyielding like steel, locked onto Nathan's. "I've been very calm, officer. From the moment you pulled me over, I've followed every procedure. But have you? Do you think your actions have aligned with the responsibilities and duties of a police officer?" Nathan didn't answer, and the space between them grew heavy, as though all sound had been sucked out of the air. Marcus continued, his voice firm and commanding. "What motivated your behavior? Professional protocol or personal bias? Think carefully, because that's going into my report." Nathan felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. In that moment, he realized any excuse he might offer would be futile. The power he thought he held had been completely overturned, but the real storm, the consequences he would have to face, was just beginning. Nathan stood frozen in place, as if the entire weight of the world had descended upon his shoulders. The badge glittered under the streetlights, an irrefutable declaration. The confidence he had carried throughout the encounter was now nothing more than an empty shell, shattered under Marcus's piercing gaze. He forced a strained smile, his eyes darting back to the badge one more time, as if hoping the mounting tension crushing him was merely a misunderstanding. But Marcus's calm, unnervingly composed expression remained unshaken. Nathan realized that every move he had made, every word he had spoken, had been laid bare before Marcus, dissected with precision. You're just trying to scare me, right?" Nathan stammered, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound firm. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer to Nathan, his gaze locked on him like an unspoken challenge. "Scare you?" Marcus echoed, his voice low but laden with authority. "No, officer. Fear doesn't come from me. It comes from your own realization, the realization that you just made the biggest mistake of your career. Marcus's words cut through Nathan's mind like a blade. He swallowed hard, the growing unease in his chest becoming impossible to ignore. His eyes dropped to the ground, but there was no escaping the unrelenting stare of Marcus. "I was just doing my job," Nathan managed to protest weakly, his voice so faint it barely convinced himself. "You don't understand. This is just standard procedure." "Standard?" Marcus interrupted, his tone quiet but carrying a terrifying weight. "What standard allows you to act like this? What standard justifies your bias and abuse of power? Or do you think the badge on your chest gives you the right to do whatever you please?" Nathan took another step back, the feeling of helplessness tightening around him like a vice. For the first time in his career, he felt like he held no power at all. Instead, he stood before a man who not only knew his rights, but also held control over him. I didn't think things would go this far," Nathan muttered, his gaze skittering away. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes sharp as knives as they bore into Nathan. "Far? You think this is just a minor incident, don't you? Once again, you're trying to downplay your responsibility. But you're wrong, officer. Your actions tonight aren't just a personal overstep. They damage the trust of the community in the force you represent." Nathan opened his mouth to respond but found no suitable words. Every defense he could muster felt meaningless in the face of the undeniable truth. He was wrong, and he had been wrong in front of someone he should never have underestimated. "So, what are you going to do now?" Nathan asked, his voice carrying more desperation than defiance. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'll do what I'm supposed to do," he said coldly but resolutely. "I'll ensure your actions tonight don't get swept under the rug. There will be an investigation, not just into you, but into how the system allows behavior like yours to persist and thrive." Nathan felt the ground beneath him crumble. He wasn't just facing personal consequences. He was confronting the reality that his actions could shake the very system he had always believed would protect him. Marcus stepped back, reestablishing a safe distance between them. "You should ask yourself," Marcus said, his voice steady but cutting, "if you even deserve to stand among those entrusted with the duty to protect and serve this community." Those words landed like the final blow, extinguishing any last attempt Nathan might have made to salvage his ego. He stood there, speechless, his pale face and vacant eyes reflecting the streetlights above. Marcus didn't need to say more. He knew the battle was over, not with shouting or arguments, but with truth and the undeniable authority he represented. And Nathan, now, was not just a defeated man. He was a lesson in what happens when power is misused. The air seemed to grow thick after Marcus's words. Nathan bowed his head, his shoulders trembling slightly under the weight of the truth that had just been laid bare. He couldn't respond, not because he lacked words, but because every justification he might have offered felt hollow against the undeniable reality Marcus had voiced. Marcus stood tall, his eyes carrying not anger but profound disappointment. "Your mistake wasn't stopping my car," he said, his voice calm yet resounding like a verdict. "Your mistake was assuming I wasn't worthy of respect, that I didn't deserve fairness from someone representing the law." Nathan still didn't lift his head, his gaze unfocused as if searching for an escape from the situation. But Marcus didn't give him that chance. He took a step closer, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about me. It's about the entire system you represent, a system that has allowed actions like yours to persist, that has enabled prejudice to become power. Marcus's words struck like blows against Nathan's already crumbling ego. He bit his lip, shame and helplessness intertwining within him, yet he lacked the courage to fight back. Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on Nathan. "Do you realize, officer, every action you've taken tonight isn't just an abuse of power. It's a message to the community that they can't trust those tasked with protecting them. That is the real problem." Nathan shifted slightly, as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. The explanations he had always relied on to justify himself were now drowned in silence. Marcus watched him for a moment, then took a deep breath, his tone softening but remaining firm. "I'm not standing here to humiliate you, Nathan. I'm standing here to remind you that the badge on your chest isn't a symbol of power. It's a symbol of responsibility. And if you can't understand that, then you don't deserve to wear it." For the first time, Nathan lifted his head, his eyes filled with confusion and regret. In that moment, he didn't feel like a police officer, just a man facing the consequences of his own mistakes. "Marcus, Nathan stammered, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling that no further words were needed. "No need for explanations," Marcus said, his voice final and resolute. "Words mean nothing now. Only your actions can make a difference." Nathan remained silent, his gaze dropping to his shoes, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Marcus stepped back, maintaining distance but keeping his eyes on Nathan. "Think carefully about what you've done tonight," he said, "because I assure you, this won't be the last time we meet. But next time, I won't just stand here as someone subjected to your abuse of power. I'll stand as someone who determines your future within this system." Those final words rang out like a potent warning. Nathan stood frozen, paralyzed by the realization that what had just happened wasn't a minor misstep. It was a turning point that could alter his career and his life. Marcus studied Nathan for another second, as if to etch the weight of his disappointment and resolve into the officer's mind. Then he turned and walked toward his sedan, leaving Nathan under the dim street lights, stripped of the protective layers he had once trusted. As Marcus opened the car door, he paused and looked back at Nathan one last time. "Remember this, officer," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the quiet night. "Respect isn't a privilege you get to choose to grant someone. It's a duty demanded by the badge you wear." Then he got into his car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Nathan standing there, lost and alone, confronted by the inescapable weight of his mistakes and their consequences. Marcus's sedan glided through the empty streets, the street lights casting fleeting reflections on his contemplative face. The confrontation with Nathan replayed relentlessly in his mind. Every word, every glance, every action etched deeply like an unshakable reminder. This wasn't just a personal incident, it was a glaring testament to a flawed system, a system Marcus was tasked with overseeing and reforming. That night, sleep eluded Marcus. In his study, he silently opened a file and began meticulously jotting down every detail of the encounter, his determined gaze illuminated by the desk lamp. He wasn't simply aiming to address Nathan's case, he wanted to unearth and dismantle the underlying conditions that allowed Nathan's behavior to persist and recur. The next morning, soft sunlight filtered through the curtains as Marcus stepped into the Internal Affairs office. On his desk lay Nathan Blake's file, a thick stack of documents filled with unresolved complaints. As Marcus flipped through the pages, a familiar pattern emerged. Nathan had a history of complaints, excessive force during inspections, allegations of discriminatory remarks, and more. Yet, every single grievance had been dismissed with explanations like insufficient evidence or misunderstanding. Marcus straightened in his chair, his thoughtful gaze fixed on the file. This wasn't just about Nathan. It was about a system that shielded and enabled such misconduct. Taking a deep breath, he closed the file and picked up his phone to call Linda, his assistant. "Linda, I need a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "There's something important we need to address." In the spacious office of Chief Daniels, sunlight from the large windows highlighted the thoughtful lines on his face. Daniels, a seasoned man with silver-streaked hair, looked at Marcus from behind his polished wooden desk. "Tell me what happened," Daniels said, his voice carrying a tone of weariness. Marcus left no detail out. He recounted the entire confrontation with Nathan, from the prejudiced remarks to the blatant abuse of authority. Daniels listened silently, his fingers interlaced, his expression growing heavier with each point Marcus made. "When I got home," Marcus concluded, "I reviewed Nathan's file. This isn't the first time he's been complained about, but those complaints were never properly addressed. Nathan isn't the only issue. He's a symptom of deeper systemic problems." Daniels sighed, his gaze drifting to the window as if searching for answers in the stillness outside. "I've known Nathan had some issues," he said, his voice contemplative. "But we always thought minor incidents like that weren't worth escalating. We didn't want to tarnish the department's image." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "That's the problem, Daniels. When you ignore minor incidents, they become the standard. And that standard doesn't just harm the individuals targeted, it erodes the credibility of the entire force." Daniels remained silent for a moment, then slowly nodded, as though absorbing every word Marcus had said. "So, what do you want to do?" he asked, his tone shifting from defensive to cooperative. "I want to initiate a comprehensive reform," Marcus replied decisively. "This isn't just about Nathan. It's about how we handle complaints, how we train officers, and how we enforce accountability across the board." Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Comprehensive reform is going to stir things up, Marcus. There'll be pushback, both within and outside the department." "I know," Marcus responded immediately, "but if we don't act now, we'll continue to lose the community's trust, and that trust isn't easily regained." Daniels sighed again, but this time it was a sigh of agreement. "All right," he said. "You have my support. Tell me your plan." Marcus nodded, a determined light in his eyes. "We'll start with Nathan," he said, "not just by investigating his actions, but by making the results public. Then we'll expand the process, reviewing policies, training, and even the complaint system." Daniels listened intently, and for the first time during their conversation a faint smile crossed his face. It wasn't a smile of contentment, but one of hope. "You know, Marcus," Daniels said, standing up and extending his hand, "if anyone can make this happen, it's you." Marcus shook Daniels's hand, and in that moment he felt a shift, not from external forces, but within the system itself. It was only the first step, but it was a necessary one toward meaningful change. In the quiet hearing room of the Sacramento Police Department, Nathan sat on a plain metal chair, facing a long table where Marcus and the members of the Internal Review Board were seated. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, as if everyone could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. Nathan no longer carried his usual arrogance. His shoulders slumped, and his gaze shifted nervously among the board members. Yet, the eyes he avoided most were Marcus's, the man who held the power to decide his future within the force. Marcus, seated at the center of the table, opened the file before him, flipping through the pages with cold precision. He lifted his head, meeting Nathan's eyes directly. "Officer Blake," Marcus began, his voice clear but not overly loud. "Today, we're here to examine your conduct during the incident last night. But let me remind you, this isn't just about a personal mistake. This is about how your actions have impacted the entire system and the trust of the community." Nathan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of his chair tightly. I know I made a mistake," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "but it wasn't my intention. I was just trying to do my job." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze sharp enough to cut through Nathan's excuses. "Doing your job?" Marcus repeated, his voice low and commanding. "Officer Blake, your job is to protect and serve, not to abuse your authority to enforce personal biases. Do not confuse duty with power." Marcus's words made Nathan bow his head, unable to meet his gaze. The room fell silent, broken only by the faint rustle of paper as Marcus turned another page in the file. "We've reviewed your record, Blake," Marcus continued, his tone firm but devoid of anger. "Multiple complaints of unprofessional conduct and abuse of authority have been noted, yet all were dismissed due to lack of evidence. Do you know what that says?" Nathan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It says this system has failed," Marcus went on. "Failed to hold you accountable, failed to protect the public from the misconduct of a police officer. And now, you've become the symbol of that failure." Nathan flinched at the remark, his hands clenched tightly on his thighs, his face betraying fear and regret. "I didn't mean to," Nathan stammered, his voice shaking. "I didn't think things would escalate like this." Marcus exhaled, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's precisely the problem, Blake," he said, his voice low but weighted. "You didn't think. You acted without understanding that every decision you make has consequences, not just for you, but for the people you're sworn to protect and the institution you represent." The room was heavy with silence. Everyone felt the gravity of Marcus's words. After a moment, Marcus turned to the other board members, his tone returning to his characteristic professionalism. "Given the evidence and testimonies presented, I recommend the immediate suspension of Officer Nathan Blake pending further investigation." No one objected. One of the board members nodded, officially declaring the decision. Nathan sat frozen in his chair, his eyes hollow as he absorbed the verdict. This was not just a suspension. It was the shattering of the confidence he once had in himself and the system he believed would shield him. Marcus stood, giving Nathan one last direct look. "This isn't the end, Blake," he said, his voice now softer but still authoritative. "This is an opportunity for you to reflect on your actions, on what you want to stand for. And I hope that when this is over, you'll understand that the responsibility of a police officer isn't about power, but service." Marcus exited the hearing room, leaving Nathan in the suffocating silence. But for Marcus, this was only the beginning. He knew that reforming the system couldn't stop with addressing one individual. This was the moment to expose deeper issues, and Marcus was ready for the challenge. Marcus stepped out of the hearing room with a determined gaze. Though he had dealt with Nathan Blake's case, he knew this was just the tip of a massive iceberg. Reforming a system required not only determination, but also the courage to face internal resistance and skepticism from the community. In the vast conference room of the Sacramento Police Department, Marcus stood before a group of senior officers. The fluorescent lights cast a sharp glow on their pensive faces as Marcus outlined his reform plan. Charts, reports, and meticulously prepared documents supported his presentation, yet the atmosphere in the room remained heavy. "Our goal is not punishment," Marcus said, his voice clear but firm. "Our goal is to restore trust, and to achieve that, we must start with ourselves." A veteran officer with silver hair, Captain Harris, clasped his hands in front of him, his expression stern. "Marcus," he said, his authoritative tone laced with doubt, "do you think a few training sessions or procedural changes can transform a system that's been entrenched for decades? You're facing a culture, not just a handful of individuals." Marcus nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not naive enough to believe everything will change overnight, Captain Harris. But if we don't start now, we'll keep spiraling into the same cycle of failure." A scoffing laugh echoed from the back of the room. Sergeant Rodriguez, a younger yet equally prideful officer, leaned back in his chair with arms crossed. "So, what's the plan? Listen to complaints? Do whatever the public wants? We're the police, not a PR firm." Marcus stepped toward Rodriguez, his eyes steely. "And you think we can fulfill our duties without the community's support? Where do you think your authority comes from if not the trust they place in us?" The room fell silent. Marcus's words weren't just a question, they were a challenge to everyone present. A few days later, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium of local residents. This was one of several events he organized to hear directly from the community, a crucial component of his reform plan. An elderly woman with a weathered face stood up. "The police have come to our neighborhood many times, but not to protect," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They come to inspect, to suspect, to make us feel unwelcome." A young black man seated in the front row added, "I've been stopped for driving an old car. They found nothing, but they made me feel like I was a criminal. Why do they always look at us like that?" Marcus listened intently, taking notes on every word. He didn't interrupt or argue, he simply let the people speak. Their stories weren't just evidence of the problem, but fuel for his determination to continue his work. As the meeting neared its end, Marcus rose to address the crowd. He scanned the room, his eyes meeting theirs, some angry, some skeptical, but others hopeful. "I'm not here to offer empty apologies," Marcus said, his voice resonant. "I'm here to commit to change, and I can't do it alone. We need you, to hold us accountable, to reflect back to us and to remind us that this badge isn't a shield to protect us from responsibility, but a symbol of service." Marcus's reform plan began to take shape. Mandatory human rights and de-escalation training sessions were held more frequently. Complaint handling procedures were overhauled to ensure transparency and accountability. An independent board with community representatives was established to oversee cases of misconduct. Yet, change didn't come easily. Marcus faced resistance from officers who felt their authority was under threat. In one internal meeting, Sergeant Rodriguez made no attempt to hide his dissatisfaction. "We're letting the community dictate how we do our jobs," he said, his tone defiant. Marcus responded without hesitation. "We're not letting them dictate. We're involving them. There's a vast difference between the two, Rodriguez, and if you can't accept that, maybe you need to rethink why you chose to wear this badge." Marcus's words silenced the room. Despite the opposition, he remained steadfast, knowing that reform wasn't just about altering systems, but also about changing the mindset of those within them. Marcus understood that what he was doing was just the beginning, but he didn't waver. Every meeting, every conversation, and every policy implemented was a small step toward a fairer system. And while the road ahead was long, the light of change had begun to shine. The large auditorium of the community center was packed. Rows of seats were filled with diverse faces, police officers in crisp uniforms, local residents with curious eyes, and city officials wearing solemn expressions. The atmosphere carried a special weight, not one of confrontation or tension, but of hopeful anticipation. Marcus stepped up to the podium, the Internal Affairs badge gleaming on his chest. He scanned the room, his gaze resting on each group, from the young officers to the residents who had been harmed by the system. In that moment, Marcus saw not only his responsibility but also the long road ahead that they all needed to walk together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice strong yet sincere, "justice is not just about punishing the bad guys. It's not merely about stopping wrongdoings or holding abusers of power accountable. True justice is about building a fair system, a system where everyone, regardless of race, profession, or background, is respected and treated equitably." Marcus's words resonated throughout the room, capturing everyone's attention. Some officers nodded in agreement, while a few residents smiled faintly, not because they were fully convinced, but because they were beginning to feel a glimmer of hope. He continued, outlining the changes that had been implemented over the past few months. The complaint handling process had become more transparent, with community representatives involved in evaluations. Mandatory training sessions on communication and situational management were now required for all officers, focusing on eliminating unconscious bias. Officers with misconduct, like Nathan Blake, had been held accountable, sending a clear message that no one was above the law. "These changes are not about diminishing the value of the police force," Marcus said, his gaze turning toward the officers' section. "They are about elevating it. We are not just enforcers of the law. We are representatives of justice, protectors of the community's trust and safety." A round of applause broke out, not loud, but enough to lighten the heavy atmosphere. After Marcus's speech, an elderly woman stood up. She wore a simple cardigan, her hands clutching her handbag as if to steady her emotions. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "For years, I lost faith in the police. But today, hearing your words and seeing what you've done, I believe we can change." Marcus nodded gently, his eyes reflecting gratitude. Her words were not just a thank you. They were proof that his efforts were beginning to reach the hearts of those who had felt abandoned. A young man sitting nearby also rose to speak. "I used to think the police never listened to us," he said, his voice hesitant but determined. "But now I understand that if we don't speak up, if we don't cooperate, change will never come." The room fell silent for a moment before a wave of applause rippled through, louder and more powerful. Marcus returned to the podium, his emotions swelling but his composure intact. "We still have a long way to go," he said, his voice dropping slightly, filled with sincerity. "These changes are just the beginning, and we won't succeed if only a few individuals are committed. We need everyone, officers, the community, and the government, to come together. Each of us has a role to play in building a fairer system." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting eyes filled with emotion, hope, skepticism, and belief. Justice is not a destination, Marcus said, his voice resonating in the quiet space. It is a journey, and I promise you, on this journey, my team and I will never stop moving forward. Marcus's words concluded with a thunderous round of applause, filling the room with a renewed sense of purpose. As Marcus stepped down from the podium, he didn't just see a change in the people's eyes, he felt a transformation within himself. This was not an ending, but a beginning, not just for the system he served, but for the community he represented. Outside the auditorium, the sky had turned a deep shade of twilight blue. Marcus took a deep breath, looking up at the vast sky. Though the road ahead was fraught with challenges, he knew he was heading in the right direction. More importantly, he knew he wasn't walking alone. Marcus's story is not just about an individual confronting injustice. It's a testament to the power of persistence and belief in change. From a tense confrontation, Marcus turned it into an opportunity to reform the system, restore trust, and build a fairer future for everyone. What do you think of Marcus's journey? Do you believe the changes in this story are enough to create a better system of justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful and worth sharing, don't forget to like and share this video so Marcus's story can inspire more people. And be sure to subscribe to our channel to catch more profound and impactful stories like this one. Thank you for watching.